Shalom, shalom. Welcome, welcome, world changers. We're back for another night. We have Onieh with us again, speaking about his version of the Book of Esther. Very, very interesting last night, wasn't it? Like some really in-depth stuff we were getting into, and some really good meat for sure. Comparing the different manuscripts, the Masoretic, the Septuagint, the Alpha text, the Latin, the Old Latin, all these different things. Very, very interesting. So looking forward for another night tonight. In the live chat, we have Calamento says shalom, everyone. We have Vinny says shalom. Welcome, welcome. Good to see you. If you, anyone that's watching right now, if you know of anybody who would be interested in tuning in, if you have any friends or family members that would be interested in listening to what we're going to be talking about tonight, make sure you send them a link and send them a message to say, hey, you know what, watch this, because it's going to be extremely interesting for sure. Every serious Bible student should actually know what we're talking about tonight. They should know about all of these different things. So this is just amazing. So this is again, this is part 2. And so let me see. All right. Onieh, are you ready? Okay. So for those of you in the live chat, give Onieh a very, very warm welcome. Shalom, Onieh. Good to see you again.
Shalom, everyone. Great to be back once again.
Great to have you back. Yeah.
Part
so,
2.
Oh man. So let's. Where do you want to start, Onieh?
So I'm just gonna briefly save this document and send it to you in the email so you can replace it. Because, like I said, I was going to try to work as much as I can on more of the Book of Esther to finish it in preparation for tonight. But I always, whenever I'm doing this Bible project work, I always underestimate the amount of time it'll take to complete these things. It actually takes so much time to go through it all. So, I was like, hopefully I was going to get chapters 4, 8, and 9 finished, but that definitely did not happen. I was able to finish the rest of the remainder of that one chapter that I had mentioned I was almost finished with. And then I was able to do all of chapter 4 except one verse. So I'm going to send that to you right now.
Sure. In the meantime, we have JIB here says shalom. We have Ravenden Apostolic Church, welcome, says shalom alechem. And welcome, welcome. Vinny says shalom, Onieh. Billy says shalom. Good to see you. Welcome, everyone. I pray that everything we share here tonight, or everything that Onieh has to share, is going to be a great blessing to all of you, and really encourage you and increase your knowledge of the scriptures. All right, so
I have just sent it. If you want, you can delete that older file, or it doesn't matter. It doesn't really take up much space on the computer. The PDF files, especially these ones, are pretty small, but each new PDF file update that I do makes the prior one obsolete. So,
okay, I haven't received it yet.
It had just been sent, so it's probably going to take just a little bit.
Yeah, and this is going to replace Esther draft.
It's replacing where it's like a very long length of numbers, like chapter numbers.
Yeah, got it. Okay, and I got got your email here as well, so I'll have this opened in just a moment.
And if you want, you can have, I would say, just the two tabs. Besides my PDF, you could have, just in case, the King James version open and a Brenton version open that has the extra chapters, because the one you were using at first seemed to not have some of the extra chapters.
So, what about the ebible.org? Is that good enough?
I believe so. Yes, yes, that's a good one. I think the one you had used before might have been from, I don't know if it was from Bible Hub or which one it was, but
Yeah, it
I
was a
think,
Bible Hub one.
yeah. But then the one you went to after, which is the one you just mentioned, I'm pretty sure that's sufficient. Now, JIB made the comment. Now, we did address this a little bit in last night's video. The Book of Esther, I think, is questionable. So I presented some basis for why I think it's not questionable, and that it is a authentic document of Scripture. But one of the more important things is the fact that the Septuagint version exists, which presents a very different version of the Book of Esther. And so the Masoretic version does not have anything to do with God at all, doesn't mention God at all, doesn't mention Torah, religion at all. But the Septuagint version mentions it all throughout. I presented my theory last night that the a lot of the additions that are found in the Septuagint were not made up, but they were simply extracted from a different, from an earlier version of Esther, which had all that information in a longer form, in a special letter at the end, near the end of the book. So the unique thing about the Septuagint version of Esther is while it has like small additions in a bunch of places, it also has very large additions, six major large additions that are not in the Masoretic text. And I believe that all these six huge additions were part of the original text in some form. Not necessarily in the current place that they are, but that they were somewhere in the Book of Esther originally. And when you see what these additions say, it makes the entire Book of Esther a very different book. So evaluating whether the Book of Esther is scripture or not, you may have a very different conclusion depending which book you're reading. If you're reading which version you're reading, the Masoretic or the Septuagint. So in my process for making my version of the Bible, uh, there's you mentioned a three-part process, and this version that I'm presenting tonight is the second part of that process, where I have taken the different versions that exist and line them up side by side to show you guys what currently exists. And then in the future, I'm going to actually fully translate everything afresh, my own translation. It's going to be like Onieh style. Like it's going to be completely unique type of translation that you've never seen before. Because most translations that are new translations, they are almost, in many times, they're verbatim, very close to other translations that already exist. There's not a lot of new stuff that is seen in any new translation. Most of the time, new translations just kind of water things down, or like they modernize things, make it gender neutral, things like that. Occasionally, they'll make a new version that has a few different variants included. Uh, but for the most part, any new translations do not really offer us anything fresh. King James version is basically the same as the modern English versions. They just have modernized the language so it doesn't sound so uh, King James-ish type of language. Um, so, so that's part three of my process, where I will eventually do a full translation of everything, but it's going to take time to do that. So for now, we are sticking with the second of uh, the step of this process. Now tonight we are only going to be, so that's in less than 2 hours. So it's about 2 hours from now. So there's a good chance we won't finish the whole thing tonight. And so if that does happen, then we will see when we want to do the follow up. And I do think that if we don't finish it tonight, that we should be able to wrap it up in a third one. But with that said, why don't we get started and jump right into it? So you did receive the PDF file?
I did, yeah. I just would like to greet Tammy here. Tammy says, Shalom all. Shalom, Tammy. Good to see you. So would you like me to open up that, share that right away?
Yeah, that would be great. And when you share it on the screen, basically I'll tell them about the 4 versions again. I'll remind about the 4 versions.
Okay, just gotta. Okay, so here it is.
Okay, so you see 4 lines in my version. The first line. Oh, and by the way, it's called Book of Esther because last time, yesterday's video, I presented my view that Esther is actually identical with the historical figure known from historical documents outside the Bible named Amestris, who was the wife of Xerxes. So I identify the 2 together. So I believe Esther's actual name was Amesther, and that it was shortened to Esther later on by scribes. So that explains the title. Now, there's 4 lines you're going to see throughout the majority of this document. Well, throughout the entirety of the document. The first line is always going to be the Masoretic text. That's the English translation that we're going to be familiar with the most from the King James Version. Because the King James Version, for the most part, is an accurate translation. It's not the best translation. It's not a super literal, but it's fairly literal, fairly word-for-word translation. Sometimes it's a little bit free with the translation, but for the most part, it does a pretty good job of word-to-word translation for the Hebrew text of the Masoretic that was passed down by the Jews. The second line is from 4 different manuscripts. 4 different manuscripts preserve this version. It's called the Alpha text. Scholars call it the Alpha text. It's preserved in Greek, and it presents a much shorter version of the Book of Esther that sometimes agrees with the Masoretic and sometimes agrees with the Septuagint. And sometimes it says its own readings, which sometimes they're very unique readings. The third line is the Septuagint line. So that is the one I have derived that primarily from Brenton's English translation, because Brenton also does a fairly good job of translating correctly the Greek text of the Codex Vaticanus. His version of the Septuagint is translated from almost entirely the one manuscript, Codex Vaticanus. So, and then the 4th line is from the Old Latin version. And the Old Latin version is a special version that was translated from the original Septuagint, or a earlier version of the Septuagint. It's not necessarily the original Septuagint version, but it was a early version that existed before our earliest copies of the Septuagint that it was translated from. So it's a very important source for having some important readings. But so to explain what the Old Latin is, so Jerome made his own version of the Bible called the Latin Vulgate, and that was translated from the Masoretic text, or a Hebrew text very close to the Masoretic text. But the Old Latin was translated from the Septuagint, or a version of the Septuagint. So it was translated from Greek manuscripts. Now, unfortunately, the Old Latin was not fully preserved in any manuscript. So you know how the Dead Sea Scrolls are fragmentary, and except for the Book of Isaiah, there's not a single book in the Dead Sea Scrolls that has been perfectly preserved in the copy. It's been fragmentary. Parts are missing in the copies. So the same thing has happened with the Old Latin text, except in some cases, more has been preserved of the Old Latin than the Dead Sea Scrolls, but in other times, the Dead Sea Scrolls preserves actually more than the Old Latin does, because there's some books of the Old Testament where there's barely anything preserved for the Old Latin. The scholars actually have to try to reconstruct the Old Latin version by looking at the church fathers, the early church fathers of the Latin language, because when they wrote, when they quoted scripture, they quoted it from the Latin version that they used at the time. So before Jerome did his translation, Jerome only did his translation in the 4th century. So which Latin Bible existed before Jerome? It wasn't the Latin Vulgate. It was the Septuagint version that was translated into Latin, which is the Old Latin version. So the early church fathers actually provide a valuable source for reconstructing the Old Latin version when we don't have a full text. Fortunately, we do have a full text for the Book of Esther. Actually, we have full manuscripts of the Book of Esther in the Old Latin. So that is a very convenient thing for us. And also convenient for us is the fact that every other book of the Old Testament has never been translated into English from the Old Latin. But Book of Esther has. The scholars decided to do the Book of Esther because it was so well preserved in the Old Latin that it deserved, and it had unique readings, some pretty unique readings. So they decided to translate it into English. So that is the 4th line. And so if you want, you can go back to the document. And so you're going to see some markings. So if you see underline, anything that's underlined is telling you that it's not in the Masoretic text if it's underlined. If it's bolded, no underline. If it's just bolded, that's telling you it's in the Masoretic text and not in the Septuagint or in the other versions. If it's bold and underlined, that means it's not in both of the other versions. It's not in the Masoretic or the Septuagint, or it's not in 2 of the other versions, basically. And there's also this thing that happens where sometimes the Septuagint and the Masoretic agree against one of the other witnesses. In that case, the Septuagint shares the same marking as the Masoretic. So they're both bolded in that case because they're harmonized. If, on the other hand, 2 different versions agree against the Masoretic text, then they share the underline. They're both underlined. Whereas the Masoretic is either bolded, or when the Septuagint has stuff that the Masoretic doesn't, it's going to be ... dots. So you'll see ... dots for the first line, first verse. It's ... the whole line, because that's because that entire line does not exist in the Masoretic text. So that's my way of underlining the Masoretic text, because I use underlines as a mark of distinction for text that's been omitted. So in the Septuagint version, if it's missing stuff that's found in the Masoretic, the Septuagint will have just underline with spaces, underline. But the Masoretic, it doesn't have the underline. Instead, it has the ... and the ... dots function as its distinct underline marking. So the markings might be a little bit confusing at first, but once you start getting the hang of it, you'll start catching on. And also, there may be times where I've made mistakes in the markings, because there's so much stuff. It's very easy to make a mistake over time. So if that happens, my apologies. So with that said, we're going to get started, and we'll start reading. Now, the primary version I'm going to be reading from is the 3rd line, at least for these extra chapters, these extra sections. Now, keep in mind that the Septuagint falsely says Artaxerxes, whereas the original text correctly says Xerxes. So for some reason, the Septuagint version, the scribes didn't agree with the identification of the king being of the Esther story being Xerxes, and they changed it to Artaxerxes. So just keep that in mind, that when you hear me say Artaxerxes, that's just what the version says, but that's technically that's not the correct reading. So we'll get started. In the second year of the reign of Artaxerxes, the great king, on the first of Nisan, Mordecai, the one from Jair, from Shimei, from Kish of the tribe of Benjamin, saw a vision. He was a Jew dwelling in the city Shushan, a great man serving in the king's palace. Now he was one of the exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried captive from Jerusalem, with Jeconiah, the king of Judah. And this was his dream. Behold, voices and a noise, thunder and earthquake, tumult upon the earth. And behold, two great serpents came forth, both ready for conflict, and a great voice came from them. And by their voice, prepared for battle was every nation, even to fight against the peoples. And, even to fight against the nation of the just. I went to the wrong line. To fight against the nation of the just. And behold, a day of darkness and blackness, tribulation and anguish, affliction and great tumult upon the earth. And fearing their own afflictions, all the righteous nation was troubled, and they prepared to die. And they cried to God, and from their cry, as though from a little spring, came a great river abounding in water. And the light and the sun arose, and the lowly were exalted and devoured the honorable. And Mordecai, having awoke, had seen this vision and what God designed to do in his heart. In his heart, he kept it, and by all means to interpret it even till night. And Mordecai rested in the palace with Gibtha and Terah, the two chamberlains of the king. And he heard their reasonings and searched out their plans, and learnt that they were planning to lay hands on Artaxerxes the king. And he informed the king about them, and the king examined the two chamberlains, and they confessed and were led away. And the king wrote these things for a memorial, and Mordecai wrote about these things. And the king commanded Mordecai to attend in the palace. So, it keeps going a little bit. And he gave gifts to him for these things. Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Bugian, I don't remember what that means, was honorable in the sight of the king. And he endeavored to hurt Mordecai and his people because of the two chamberlains of the king. So we'll stop there for a second. So I mentioned last night how this seems to be intrusive to the Book of Esther, because later on it introduces Mordecai for the first time I believe it's in chapter 2. So it doesn't make sense to introduce Mordecai in this spot right here. So I argued that this dream that we have actually is derived from another part of the Book of Esther that used to be part of the Book of Esther. It was from a letter later on in the book in chapter 9. And so when the scribes decided to remove that letter, the Septuagint scribes extracted some of the things they liked from that letter, and they inserted them in the different places of the Book of Esther to make sure that the things that were in that extra letter were not, the most important things that were in that letter were not lost. So I believe that this vision, this dream, is authentically part of the Book of Esther, but that it was just not at the beginning of the book. It was moved from a different part. And just so you guys know, this is not a implausible scenario, because we actually have other examples of this happening in other books of the Old Testament, where the Septuagint has passages that are in a completely different spot. It's been rearranged compared to the Masoretic version. So either the Masoretic version rearranged it or the Septuagint rearranged it. But we have plenty of examples of texts being rearranged in books of the Old Testament. So it is certainly plausible that some of these extra passages may be authentic, but not necessarily in the correct spot that they should be. So before we move on, I just want to note a couple things. For the most part, as you could see from these things, most of the differences are not major differences. If you want to go back to verse 1, we will see that the Old Latin version, which is the fourth line, incorrectly has the name of one of the uh, no, I'm sorry, the beginning chapter, the chapter 1a. Um, so the name of for Mordecai's genealogy, the Old Latin has incorrectly, it has Ishaeus. So basically, that corresponds to the man Kish. But so the Septuagint has Kishaeus. The us or the eus is simply a ending for the grammatical form of the Greek language. The Latin is translating the Greek form, but for some reason in their copies they accidentally dropped out the K. So their version says that Mordecai is a descendant of a man named Ish, which is false. He's a descendant from a man named Kish. So that's just one example where that has been something that's been corrupted in the Old Latin version. Now you'll see that the sometimes there's major clauses that are in one version but not in the other. But often they don't change the meaning too much. But so in verse 2, for example, it says, "He was a Jew dwelling in the city Shushan." That phrase, "a Jew dwelling in the city Shushan," is not in the other two versions. But overall, that phrase seems to be authentic. The evidence seems to indicate that the scribes would remove that phrase for being unnecessary. So we can make some of these observations for these things to determine which phrases have been added or which phrases have been removed. Sometimes it's ambiguous or it's subjective, is what I mean, where it's not always definite which clause was added or which was removed, but we can have good educated guesses of which text should be part of the original. For example, uh, line 3. If we look at line 3, the one version says captive from Jerusalem with Jeconiah, the king of Judah. The other version says just captive. It doesn't say from Jerusalem. So which reading is correct? What would we say? Well, if we simply go to chapter 2, verse 5, we're going to, excuse me, verse 6, chapter 2, verse 6, we're going to see which reading is the correct reading. Chapter 2, verse 6. That is on page 13. So as we see, you notice it says from Jerusalem. From Jerusalem. So that phrase from Jerusalem most likely is part of the original text in chapter 1a. So we can use parallel clauses like this to determine which readings are more likely to be correct. So the Septuagint version has from Jerusalem in agreement with chapter 2, verse 6, whereas the Alpha text omits from Jerusalem. And something else to keep in mind is that the Alpha text consistently removes words that the other versions have. So because that's a consistent characteristic of that version, in general, we're going to side with the fuller readings, except there are times when the fuller readings seem to be more of clarification by later scribe. And the Alpha text sometimes may actually be preserving the original shorter text. But again, determining when the shorter text is original and when it's not is sometimes it's a bit of subjectivity. But there are some good principles that can be used to try to determine when the text is authentic and when it has been altered. So, um, so let's see here. Also, in general, we're going to see like chapter 1a, verse 5. You'll see, behold, two great serpents and a great voice. So, versus the alpha text, it says just serpents and just voice. Notice the alpha text removes great in both instances. Both other versions have the word great in both times. So that supports the idea that great has been removed from the alpha text. So as you can see, this is a process of determining which readings are more likely to be authentic. Then you have verse 6, which is a little bit more confusing in terms of how they differ in the readings. You'll see in verse 6, it's a bit more different than the other verses so far. So now, strangely, we do want to point out the Septuagint version in verse 6 says, they sought to dominate the nation of the just, or the nation of the righteous. So that actually seems to be a suspicious reading, because let me see for a second here. Yeah, so the alpha text, the second line, does not say the just. It just says the peoples. It seems unlikely that the scribe would say, oh, this is the righteous nation, and they remove the word righteous, because that's a very important detail, that the nation was righteous. So this is a time where the shorter text seems to be more authentic, because it's a dream. He was having a dream. So he was dreaming about the people, but it makes more sense for the interpretation of the dream to tell you the interpretation of the dream. This is the righteous nation. But when you're dreaming, usually you're not dreaming about like all these special details of like emphasizing that it was the righteous nation. So that's my suggestion for that difference right there. And then line 7, you'll see it's a day of blackness, darkness and blackness, tribulation and anguish, affliction and great tumult upon the earth. Now notice again the word great. The alpha text removes the word great. So again, it's a consistent theme here. The alpha text consistently is removing great from the readings. And the other two versions are both saying great. But also, not only that, but the alpha text and the Old Latin are shorter. So, but the fuller text is the way Scripture often works is it does parallelisms. So, it says the same phrase multiple times in slightly different wording. So sometimes we will find in the Septuagint or in other versions of the Old Testament, they don't like the repetitions, so they remove those repetitions. So this phrase, tribulation and anguish, affliction, most likely is authentic, just because of the fact that scribes often removed repetitious things like that. And then let's see here. And once again, verse 8, it says, every nation prepared to fight, whereas the Septuagint says, all the righteous nation was troubled. So again, the Septuagint is emphasizing that they're righteous. It seems unlikely that the scribe of the alpha text would remove the word righteous. And not only that, keep in mind that the word righteous, like, in these other examples where I said the word great is not in the one version, but it's in both other versions. Well, in the case of the detail of the nation being righteous, That's omitted in the two versions. It's omitted in the Alpha text and it's omitted in the Old Latin text. If you look at back in verse 6, where it says the nation of the just, both the Alpha text and the Old Latin do not mention the just or righteous at all. So that's a agreement against the Septuagint. And then again in verse 8, the Old Latin and the Alpha text both do not say that the nation was righteous. So again, this is a detail that most likely was added by the Septuagint version. And then an interesting difference, verse 9, is the Alpha text says, we cried to the Lord. The Septuagint says, they cried to God. Now, God and Lord are basically synonymous for the most part, but the more interesting difference is the fact of the pronoun of we versus they. We suggest that Mordecai is in the dream was being included, whereas they suggest he was dreaming about something else and he wasn't necessarily being included in the dream, because actually they seems to be the more correct reading, because later on the interpretation of the dream is Mordecai is the serpent. He's one of the serpents. It says there was two great serpents, and Mordecai was one of those serpents. So he would not be the we that's crying out to the Lord, because he is the serpent in the dream. So they is more likely to be correct, and it was probably changed to we to because Mordecai, the scribes were like, well, Mordecai is part of that group. So if on the other hand, you could make the argument that this is a fragment of the original text, which was originally in first person, because I have made the argument that some of the books of the Old Testament were originally in first person, but then they were changed to third person. So I made the argument just now that the they reading is correct, but there is still a possibility that the we reading is correct due to the fact that there is the phenomenon in other books where the first person has been altered to third person. So we don't want to absolutely dismiss this reading of we as being authentic. It may actually be a remnant of the original text. And then we have in verse 10, the rivers, Alpha text says rivers, whereas the other two versions say lowly. So that's a bit of a difference in interpretation there. So now let's see here. I'm going to skip some of this because most of these differences are now not significant. But at the bottom of verse 11, we will see, at the bottom of verse 11, we're going to see the names of the chamberlains. Now, the Alpha text has it named as Esteos and Thedutus. And the Septuagint says Gibtha and Terah. So those names are both entirely wrong. So we're going to see the basis of why those names are there. So let me point you to the place. Can you go to page 17 of the document? And it's going to be verse 21. And we're going to see the different names preserved in different versions. So we got the correct readings of their names are Bigthan and Teresh. And then the Old Latin version says, for some reason, it says Berthag and Tedesh. Now we know in manuscripts of Hebrew, as well as translation of those Hebrew manuscripts, that the letters Dalet and Resh were very often confused, which correspond to the letters R and D in the English language. So because of that, it makes a lot of sense that the Septuagint incorrectly interpreted it as Tadesh. It was actually Teresh, but they misread it as a D instead of an R, or a Dalet instead of a Resh. Now, Bigtha and Tadesh, that is preserved by Josephus. Josephus has that version. So sometimes in this version that I have a fifth line, and that fifth line preserves readings from Josephus that correspond with the text. So we see that the names Bigtha, Josephus used a version of the Septuagint which said Tadesh instead of Teresh. And Tadesh is probably not correct because if I remember correctly, Teresh is the more etymologically correct name for like an authentic Persian name. So Tadesh is not correct. And then I have two other lines there where I have Giptha and Terah. That's from chapter 1a. And then I have the Asta reading. So each of these versions preserve correctly the letter Tav, the TH part, Ta. They drop the N. All of them drop the N. That often happens in Greek. The N gets dropped sometimes. But the main difference is the Septuagint version switches the letters. So that happens too in manuscripts of the Hebrew, where the scribes misread or miscopy, and they switch the letters around. Have you ever heard people make the mistake or wrote the mistake? Someone's trying to say the word God in English, but they accidentally say dog, or they type dog instead. Totally accidental, but that has happened sometimes in English. That's the same phenomenon that's happening here, where writing the letters in the wrong order. We do that all the time. Like when we're typing, we will mistype the one letter first. Now, obviously, when the scribes wrote, they weren't typing, so it wasn't as easy to flip the letters around. But they often flip the letters around just by confusing it in their brain. Like, people have dyslexia. Well, the ancients had their own form of dyslexia too, where they made those types of mistakes. So the correct reading for the names is the Masoretic text, Bigthan and Teresh. Strangely, the Septuagint gets horribly wrong the names most of the time. They bungled the names for most of the people in the Book of Esther. For some reason, the scribes responsible for it had a very difficult time accurately rendering the names here. So now what we're going to do is, and by the way, the alpha text preserves correctly Xerxes and not Artaxerxes. Now, you know how I talked about the differences between shorter text versus longer text and when to determine which times the shorter text is authentic? Well, I have concluded that much of the time, a large majority of the time, when you have a noun and then you have a versus a pronoun, a noun versus a pronoun in the two different versions, most of the time the pronoun is the correct reading. The more ambiguous form is the more correct reading. So let me see, where was the example that I just saw? It was, okay, verse 13 of 1a. The alpha text says, after thinking about it, Mordecai reported about them. The Septuagint says, he informed the king about them. So you have a he versus Mordecai. It's not 100%, but most of the time when that happens, you can go with the pronoun instead of the actual name being used. Because the way language works is you introduce the person and then you stop using their person's name and then you just keep using pronouns. That's why pronouns exist, so you don't have to keep using their name. Or you don't have to keep using the noun over and over again. Like, for example, if you were to have like a sentence or like a paragraph and you say, the king did such and such, And then the king did this. And then the king did this. And then the king did that. And then the king did this. It doesn't make sense to keep saying the king, the king, the king, the king each next sentence. The way language works is the first time it says, and the king did this, and then he 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 did this. The reason we sometimes see names in one version and pronouns in the other is because sometimes the pronouns make it unclear who's being talked about. And so the names are added to bring clarification. Because you think about it, why would a scribe remove the name to make it more confusing? It doesn't make sense for the scribe to remove people's names to create a more confusing text. It makes more sense for the original text to be more ambiguous. Who's he talking about? Oh, it's talking about Mordecai, I think. So I'm going to say Mordecai. Or who's he talking about? Oh, it's talking about the king. I'm going to add the word king. So this is a principle that you're going to see a lot in different books of the Old Testament, or even in the New Testament, where there's a pronoun versus a name, and most of the time the pronoun is going to be the correct reading and not the name. Okay, so let's see here. So now before we go to chapter 1, I want you to go all the way down to chapter 10. We're going to do very end of the book. And you might ask, why? Oh, yeah, and by the way, that is page 80. Oh, whoops, I don't have it formatted correctly. Page 82. Sorry for the improper formatting. It should be at the top of the page, but I did not have it at the top of the page. So the first 3 verses are from chapter 10. So we're not going to read those at the moment. But the Septuagint, basically after those 3 verses, it then adds the final extra chapter. And that extra chapter is the sequel to the dream portion that we just read prior to this. So that's why we're going to read it right now, so you can see the connection to the dream. So now all 3 versions, besides the Masoretic text, the 3 versions have the dream fulfillment as well. So we'll go and read. And like I said, the formatting is bad. I forgot to fix the formatting when I sent him the PDF, the updated PDF. So you're going to go to verse 4. And like I said, the formatting it goes onto the next page accidentally. So the 3rd line I'll be reading from primarily. Okay, so, and Mordecai said, "These things have been done of God. For I remember the dream which I had seen concerning these matters. For not one word of them has failed to be fulfilled. There was a little spring which became a river, and there was light and the sun and much water. The river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen. And the 2 serpents are I and Haman. And the nations are those that gathered to destroy the name of the Jews." And then, interestingly, verse 9, the beginning of verse 9 is not in the Septuagint version. So I'll read that after. But so continuing with the 3rd line, "But my nation, this is Israel, they that cried to God and were delivered. For the Lord delivered his people, and the Lord rescued us out of all these calamities. And God has done such signs and great wonders that have not been done among the nations. And he ordained 2 lots, one for the people of God and one for all the nations. And these 2 lots approached the hours at the right time and day of the lordship of the everlasting one among all the nations. And God remembered his people and vindicated his inheritance. And these things in the month Adar, on the 14th and on the 15th of the month, shall they observe with an assembly and joy and gladness before God from generation to generation forever among his people Israel." And then there's a epilogue. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said that he was a priest and a Levite, and Ptolemy his son, brought in the published letter of Pure, which they said existed, and which Lysimachus, the son of Ptolemy, who was in Jerusalem, had interpreted. The word interpreted means translation. So that which Lysimachus, the son of Ptolemy, had translated. So let's talk about a few of these differences here for a second. So first of all, this is clearly a fulfillment of the dream, right? So what's interesting is that you can actually use this chapter and compare it with the earlier chapter in chapter 1a to see which variants are more likely to be correct. Because sometimes some of the variants from chapter 1a actually agree with a different version of the fulfillment. So we can use the fulfillment as a parallel source to compare with. So right away, I want to point you to verse 5. And again, remember how I talked about the pronouns. So verse 5, the pronouns have the alpha text has he.
What page is that?
That is on page 82. So not in the beginning. It's right in the same section we're at. So verse 5. Oh, I'm sorry, 83. Sorry, top of 83. And that's verse 5. Okay, so you're going to see 3 different versions. He versus Mordecai versus I. So remember I said if there's a name there that's probably not, and compared to another version that has the pronoun is probably correct. So he is more likely to be correct than Mordecai. But I also mentioned how there's a tendency in some books of the Old Testament for the first person to be changed to the third person. So I would argue that the first person readings here in the Septuagint version are the correct, and that a later scribe changed it to he, and then the later scribe changed I or he changed it to Mordecai. So that's an example of pronoun differences, and you're going to see pronoun differences in other books of the Old Testament. So sometimes pronoun differences can be hugely significant. For example, in the Law of Moses, in our copies of the Law of Moses, it says Yahweh your God, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the copy called the Temple Scroll, the Book of Deuteronomy, commandments, instead of saying the Yahweh your God, it says I or me or I am Yahweh your God. It'll say I or me or my, but the Deuteronomy says in the same verses, the same exact passages, it'll say Yahweh your God. So the Temple Scroll, with the shorter reading of the pronoun my, me, and I, is more likely to be the original. And this phenomenon, like I said, occurs in other books of the Old Testament as well in certain variants. So here we have that pronoun difference. Now, verse 6, you see, there was the little spring which became a river, and there was light in the sun and much water. That is not in the other versions, not in the other 2 versions. And then let's see here. And in line 2 and 4 of verse 6, it says it does not say the whom the king married and made queen. You would think that the scribes would see that detail as like a tedious, like unnecessarily repetitious, so they would remove that detail because we already know that Esther was married to the king and made queen. Let's see here. Oh, I want to point you guys. So notice in verse 5. Remember in verse 5 where I said I and the one says he? But look at verse 6. And, excuse me, look in verse 7. All three versions in verse 7 have the first person. It has I, and me. So it's unlikely that the original author used inconsistent pronouns. Inconsistent pronouns are evidence that the text was changed. And we see inconsistent pronouns all the time throughout the Old Testament. It's in so many books, including books of the prophets. There's inconsistent pronouns all the time. It'll switch from first person to third person all the time. It's really bizarre the way it happens. Let me see. Is there one example to show you guys? Let's see here. 1 second. Okay. Can you go to a Blue Letter Bible? No, not Blue Letter. Whatever. King James Version, whatever version you want to use. Go to chapter 7 of Isaiah. So now take a look at verse 7. 7 verse 3. It says, then said Yahweh unto Isaiah, third person. Now go to chapter 8. And it says 8 verse 1, moreover, Yahweh said unto me. Now it's first person. 1 second here. I'm just opening Isaiah for a second. Okay. 1 second here. Well, there's plenty of other examples in other books where this thing happens, where basically, like, sometimes in the middle of the text, it'll change. I'm going to see if I find one other example of this. Okay, so can you go to it's the book of Amos, and I want you to go to 1 second here. First, go to chapter 1 of Amos. No, yeah, hold on. I don't think it's chapter 1. Sorry, it's chapter 7. So when you're at chapter 7, you're going to see that it says, "Thus the Lord God showed me," verse 1. Then, verse 4, "Thus Yahweh God showed me." Verse 7, "Thus he showed me." Verse 8, "And Yahweh said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line." Verse 10, "Then Amaziah the priest of Bethel sent to Jeroboam king of Israel, saying," verse 12, "Then Amaziah said to Amos," verse 14, "Then Amos answered and said to Amaziah." And then chapter 8, it switches back to first person. Thus, verse 1, "Thus Yahweh God showed me." And this type of thing happens in other books as well, where it's claiming that Yahweh speaks, Yahweh is talking, and all of a sudden Yahweh starts talking about himself in the third person. It doesn't make sense. So there's evidence in books of the Old Testament where the pronoun changed. So keep that in mind. So now back to the document that I made. Interestingly, so remember I said in verse 6, it says there's that first part of verse 6 is not in the other two versions. It says light and the sun and much water. Some of that actually appears in verse 9 in the Alpha text. It says, "The sun and the light are the revelation of God that appeared to the Jews." And then the Old Latin version says the sun and the moon were the Jews. So this is very interesting because even though the Old Latin text is shorter, the Old Latin is a witness to a text similar to the Alpha because it has this phrase in the same place. Let me just double check that to corroborate it. I'm just going to double check. Yeah, so it's in the same exact place as the Alpha reading. So we have two witnesses against the Septuagint here, and it seems weird that the reading would be invented, like out of thin air. So there may be authentic original text there that the Septuagint has incorrectly omitted. It's giving the interpretation of the sun and the light. Because without, let's see here, it says the sun. So let's see where the sun is in the dream. Yeah, in the dream, in 1a, verse 10 talked about the light and the sun. So in the interpretation of the dream, what is the sun? The Septuagint doesn't give us the interpretation of what the sun and the light is. But the other two versions do. The Alpha text and the Old Latin give us the interpretation. So that reading is probably to be correct because that gives the fuller fulfillment of the dream. But then we have the interpretation of who the nation is, where it says in the Septuagint, "My nation, this is Israel, that they cried to God and were delivered, for the Lord delivered his people, and the Lord rescued us out of all these calamities." That seems to be authentic, but the other two versions don't preserve it for some reason. And I don't know necessarily why they would have omitted that. Let's see here. And interesting, in verse 12, the Alpha text adds an extra thing where, and if you look, it says, God remembered his people in the two versions, but the Old Latin says he. Now, it gets complicated because the Alpha and the Septuagint both say God. So they're a united witness against the Old Latin. On the other hand, remember the principle that I talked about, how in general, not 100% of the time, but in general, a pronoun is more authentic than a name or a noun, a proper noun. So God is not as likely to be correct here, and he is probably more likely to be correct. But the thing I'm pointing you guys to is the second line, the Alpha text, where it says, and all the people cried out in a loud voice and said, Blessed are you, Lord, who remembers the covenants made with our fathers. Amen. That's a unique reading, which could potentially be authentic, but it's not preserved in the other two versions. On the other hand, so that almost sounds like a doxology that sometimes is added at the books, by Christians. They'll sometimes add like doxologies when it says like Amen. So it's not 100% clear, but there's a good chance that that line may be authentic part of the text that was removed from the other versions. Okay, and then and the very cool thing of that epilogue where it tells us when the Septuagint version was actually created. It tells us that it was created in the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra. So that's very interesting historical information for us to have an idea of where this version comes from. So with that said, let us go now back all the way to chapter 1. Not 1a, but 1... Did I call it 1b? I think I just said chapter 1 in this version. So that would be on page 5. Okay, so now that we are on page 5, we'll take a look at some of these things here. You'll notice the Masoretic text right away, the first verse, it does not say after these things, whereas the Alpha text and the Septuagint say after these things. It seems like a scribe added that because the scribe, remember I said I don't believe that dream was was at the beginning of the book originally. I think it was much later on in the book, and that a scribe rearranged it and put it at the beginning. And if that's the case, it would make sense why a scribe would then have to then say after these things. But guess what? That reading doesn't make sense because what just happened before? Just before, in verses chapter 1a verses verses 11 all the way to the end to 18, those things say, they talk about how Mordecai turned and reported the 2 chamberlains and saved the king's life, and then Haman tried to kill him. And then it says after these things. Well, it didn't happen after these things. It happened before those things. So after is actually inaccurate. But the scribe added after to try to make it be more fluent from what was put at the beginning of the book. But what's cool is that the Old Latin preserves the original text that agrees with the Masoretic, where it does not say after these things. So the Old Latin agrees with the Masoretic. So that's an important detail there. So now, again, remember, Xerxes is the correct name, not Artaxerxes. So the Septuagint incorrectly says from India only. It doesn't say India to Ethiopia. All the other versions, including Josephus, say India to Ethiopia. So we know the full phrase is correct, and that the Septuagint just made a mistake there. And when I say Septuagint, it doesn't mean the original Septuagint. It means the Septuagint that was preserved by the church later on. The one that Brenton translated is the main Septuagint version. Now, verse 2, remember I said that this is a process where sometimes I might make mistakes. So verse 2 has king underlined. I don't think that's actually my mistake. I think that was my friend's mistake who did that. But king is underlined in the third and fourth line. It should not be underlined. It should just be bolded. So that's something I'll have to fix later on in my editing process. But so now we take a look and we see that often the Masoretic and the Septuagint will, throughout this, we're going to see that sometimes the Septuagint closely aligns with the Masoretic against the other two versions. And in those cases, the Septuagint is more likely to, and the Masoretic together are more likely to be the correct reading. But especially when the Septuagint disagrees with all the other versions, the Septuagint is probably wrong. So, for example, in verse 2, it says, upon the throne, all the other versions say upon the throne of his kingdom. And they also say, it says they sat upon the throne of his kingdom. Whereas the Septuagint, it doesn't say sat, and it doesn't say of his kingdom. So the Septuagint is the outlier there. So the Septuagint is probably the incorrect one. So do you see the way this works? When we have this evidence of the different versions, we can actually have a good basis to try to determine which readings are correct. In verse 3, two of the versions say the third year of his reign. Josephus agrees with the third year. Old Latin, for some reason, it says the 12th year of his reign. So we're not quite sure how that reading came to be. But the third reading is probably correct because it agrees with both the Masoretic and the Septuagint, and Josephus corroborates it. So that's probably the correct reading. We will see often in the Septuagint that when the Masoretic says princes, for some reason the Septuagint changes it to companions. The Brenton translation will say friends, but I believe that's not necessarily meaning friends, but companion, like someone who's an acquaintance. So I changed the Brenton text to say companion instead of friend in those instances there. And let's see here. Now we're not going to go through. I mean, it seems like we're going through all the differences, but we're not going to go through all the tedious differences here because some of them are minor things. So, like a minor thing, for example, is in verse 4, it says showed to them in the Septuagint. It just says showed in the Masoretic. So you're going to see small differences like that throughout the book. Small differences like that are not always easy to tell which is the original text, but most of the time it doesn't actually matter too much. Sometimes you'll have things like in verse 4, the two versions say his kingdom, but the Alpha text says the king. So it's the same, it's almost the same reading, it's just slightly different translation. Now you see the brackets. The brackets is in my version, it's squiggly brackets. So those are telling you that same phrase occurs elsewhere in the book, usually in the same verse or in a surrounding verse. So in the first two versions, Masoretic and the Alpha text, it says the glory of. Where does that phrase glory of come from? Where is that found in the Septuagint version? Well, notice in the Septuagint version, line 3, it occurs in the next line. It occurs it says the riches of the majesty of his kingdom and the glory of the honor of his riches. So notice that majesty of, in the third line, is found in the next line of the Masoretic. So in the third line, majesty comes first, and then glory comes next. In the Masoretic, glory comes first, and majesty comes second. And the Alpha text supports the Masoretic here. And so the Masoretic text is almost certainly to be the correct reading in these instances, and the Septuagint is just translating freely. Okay, so now verse 5. When these days were completed, versus the Septuagint, which says, when the days of the marriage feast were completed, or of the feast. So the Alpha text agrees and says, until the days. It does not say of the marriage feast. So this is an example where the more ambiguous text is probably the correct reading. It's the same principle that we talked about earlier, where you introduce someone's name, and now you don't have to keep saying their name over and over again. You can simply refer to it shorthand by a pronoun. In this case, you can use the word these as a shorthand to what was mentioned. So, so the banquet was mentioned in verse 3 already. So these, supported by the two versions, Septuagint, the shorter text is more likely to be correct. I will also point out to you guys that the Old Latin often has a lot of missing text that's not in the other that is in the other versions. So in those cases, the Old Latin is almost certainly to be incorrect by removing that text. So all of not all, but like the second half of verse 3, if you look at verse 3, the second half of it is in the fourth line is gone. And then you look at verse 4, it's not there, it's all gone. I need to line it up better. You can see that it's not perfectly lined up. The underlining, the underline needs to be lined up better. But basically, the fourth line is completely missing. And now go to line 5, verse 5. Verse 5. The first part of verse 5 completely missing for the fourth line. But then it is in the second half of the verse 5. But notice, look, it says those who are present, but look at those is lowercase. Now, of course, Latin didn't have upper and lowercase when it was being translated. It was all written in one form. But the translation is lowercase because it's telling you it's continuing the prior sentence from that version. So go back to verse 3 and we go to the fourth line. So we're going to read it, and it's the 12th year of his reign. Sorry, let me see here. In those days, as King Artaxerxes was upon the throne in Shushan, the citadel, I got to double check. Hold on, let me see what the Latin says in the PDF. 12th year. It just says in the 12th year. So yeah, I got to fix that. In the 12th year of his reign, he made a banquet for those who were present in Shushan the citadel, from verse 5. It flows perfectly. And that is because the same exact word occurs in both verses. Verse 3, it says banquet for. And then you go to verse 5, it says banquet for. So this is probably a case of what's called I don't know the pronunciation of it exactly, but it's like or something. I just butchered it, but let me look it up and send it to you on Wikipedia. I'm gonna post it to you, Christopher, in a private chat. So have you I'll have you look. You can click that Wikipedia and show that article. Okay, so as we see here, this is a phrase where it refers to a repetition of endings in words. So it's used to refer to rhyming, but it's also used in textual criticism of the Bible for a scribal error. So click the part of the Wikipedia article which says scribal error. And so now we will read, in the field of paleography and textual criticism, homotelotum has also come to mean a form of copyist error present in the ancient texts. A scribe would be reading out a new copy of a frequently reproduced book, such as the Bible. As the scribe was reading the original text, his eyes would skip from one word to the same word on a later line, leaving out a line or two in the transcription. When transcripts were made of the scribe's flawed copy and not the original, errors are passed on into posterity. And it talks about an example of this that was discovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the Dead Sea Scrolls preserves the original text, and all other versions have missing text due to this phenomenon of the same word being in a later line, a couple lines down, and the entire text in between is missing. You'll think, oh, well, this probably doesn't happen too often, right? Unfortunately, it happens all the time by the scribes. I have done intensive study, exhaustive study of differences between Masoretic and Septuagint, and I can tell you this happens a lot, where the Septuagint will have missing text due to this because they skipped a line accidentally, and the Masoretic often skips a line that the Septuagint has, and it goes to the same exact word a line or two down. So this is a phenomenon that happens many, many times, unfortunately, way too many times in the Old Testament. But so this is why the Old Latin text does not preserve those parts of those verses. It was the second half of verse 3, all of verse 4, and the first half of verse 5. That's because the same phrase, banquet for, is found in both places. Okay. Now, the verse 5, the Masoretic and the Alpha text say 7 days. Josephus says 7 days. The Septuagint says 6 days. Now, what's interesting is that this variant actually occurs periodically throughout the Old Testament quite a lot. For example, in the one book for the census, it says 666. In the other book, it says 667. Let me see. 660. Let me just corroborate this. Oh, that's right. King James Version. It's going to word it differently. I'll get to. Hold on a second here. Okay, can you go to chapter 7, verse 18? So verse 18. Adonikam, 600 So that's 660. Okay. Now keep that in mind. It's going to go to Ezra chapter 2. Okay. Now Ezra chapter 2, verse 13. Adonikam 666. Now, as we know, 666 is the number of the devil, and so clearly, these people were of Satan, unless, according to Nehemiah, they were not. So the Jews must have known. The Jews probably wanted to conceal the identity of the Antichrist, so they changed it to 667. No, that's not the case. I'm just joking. But it's just kind of a funny thing that the one version says 6, and you know how people get all worked up about, oh, that's the evil number. But the other version, Book of Nehemiah, Hebrew Bible, it says 667, not 666. So why is it 666 in one and 667 in the other? For some reason, 6 and 7 was easily confused. Potentially. Another example is in where it's probably not confused, but it was probably intentional change, is in chapter, let's see, well, it's basically in Genesis, where it says God rested. Let's see. So if you want to go to chapter 2, King James. Okay. On the seventh day, God ended his work, which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day. So now can you go to Brenton, Genesis 2, verse 2. Okay, and God finished on the sixth day his works which he had made, and he ceased on the seventh day from all his works which he made. So the this reading is supported by the Septuagint version. It's supported by the Septuagint, and it's supported by the Book of Jubilees. So 3 witnesses against the Masoretic text. 6 versus 7. So this is a thing that happens. There's other examples of this too, for some reason.
So the three
witnesses. In some of these cases,
3 witnesses were what?
Septuagint, the Samaritan Torah, and Jubilees in Genesis.
Okay.
Yeah, for this specific variant of 6th versus 7th. I'm just giving some examples of 6th versus 7th in manuscript variants to show that this seems to be a common thing that happens for some reason. So it's not unprecedented, is what I'm suggest here. So we go back to our my text, verse 5. You have the 7 days, verse 6 days. And I think does it mention a 7th day anywhere? Yeah, in verse 10 it mentions the 7th day. See, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was feeling good with wine. So in that case, you see, someone's like, wait a minute. But verse 10 seems to say they were feasting for 7 days. So you could see why a scribe might look at the text and it says 6 days, and they say, no, it should be 7 days because he was still feasting on the seventh day. So that's an interesting thing there. I will also say that in my version, you'll notice sometimes the text is a little bit smaller. The font's a little bit. To go back to verse 5, the very end of verse 5, you'll see the font is tiny for celebrating his deliverance. I only did that in order to try to fit it on the line so it doesn't go onto a separate line. That's the only reason. So now, verse 6, it said Septuagint adds gold to the description of the rings, and then verse 7 is very interesting because the Septuagint, out of nowhere, it says that the value of it was 30,000 talents. None of the other versions say that. So that's a unique variant that could potentially be authentic because it's not entirely clear where that variant comes from. On the other hand, the Masoretic text has the Hebrew reading, so I wouldn't necessarily assume that Septuagint reading is correct. I'd have to do more study on it, but that is a very peculiar difference there. So now let's see here. In my version also, you'll see I say Washti instead of Vashti. That's because it's a wa, not a vav. So in my opinion, W rather than V should be the more correct rendering. Now let's see here. The Septuagint consistently shortens special phrases that are what you might call Hebrew idioms. So if you go to verse 10, it says, on the seventh day, the king, the Septuagint, was feeling good. The Masoretic text more fully says, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was feeling good with wine. That is a Hebraism, good with wine. So the Septuagint reading, the shorter reading, is more explainable as a alteration to remove a foreign language thing that Greeks aren't used to. Feeling good with wine. That's a weird way to say it. The Old Latin version translates it to say tipsy. So the Old Latin version seems to have had a text that agrees with the Masoretic. So all the other versions say good with wine. The Old Latin is translating good with wine as tipsy. But the Septuagint only translates good. It does not translate the with wine part. Because the actual Hebrew text says the word good and the word with wine. I'll double check that. Esther 1:10. Yeah, so the King James Version says the heart of the king was merry with wine. So when I consulted the Hebrew text, it has the word good there. So I changed the word merry to good in my version of comparison here. There's times where I'll change the King James text slightly based on the Hebrew text to show how it lines up more with the other versions. So, and then in verse 10 also, we see the differences in the names in the versions. So the Alpha text does not give the names at all, whereas the three other versions do give names. So the Alpha text almost certainly is incorrect here for not including the names, because nowhere else are these names included. You know how I said most of the time, if there's names versus pronouns. The pronouns are going to be correct, like I said, most of the time. But in this case, these people have not been introduced yet. So it doesn't make sense for these names to be invented out of thin air. So they had to be part of the original text. So it's clearly shortened in the Alpha. So the Masoretic is the only one we can really trust for the names. So the names are Mehuman, Biztha, Herbana, Bigtha, Abigtha, Zather, and Carcass. Now the Septuagint of the three versions seems to preserve the names. Of the two other versions that preserve the names, the other, like the Septuagint type, it seems that the Septuagint, the third line, is more in common with the Masoretic. So we have Eaman, that's close to Mehuman, but the Mehu is removed accidentally by the scribe. Then we have Bizan versus Biztha. So clearly the scribe made the mistake there and changed it to An. Herbana versus Thurraba. So remember I said the N often gets dropped in Greek names, so the N must have been dropped there. And then we have Bigtha versus Barazi. That one's quite different. Abigtha versus Abitza. Oh, and by the way, the names are in a different order if you go to Brenton. Why don't you go to Brenton for a second? Go to verse 10 of chapter 1.
I'll go to the Greek version here.
It's yeah. So let's take a look at the names that they have in order. So Ammon, Bazan, and you'll notice it's slightly different than how I spelled it. I tried to alter the spelling to be more similar to the Masoretic spelling. So Ammon, Bizan, they say Bezan. Thara, where's Thara? That's at the end. I put it at the end. Baraza, that I have it Barazi. That's the fourth one. And then Zatholta, that's two ones later in my version. Then Abatsa, that's the one before in my version. And then they have Tharaba as the last one. So you notice that I switched the names around to line them up with the Masoretic names more accurately, due to my belief that which names are the ones that correspond. Because if you look, Abidza or Apataza looks very similar to Abigtha, doesn't it? Abataza looks similar to Abigtha. So I line those up, and then Herbana is very similar to Thuraba. Like it has the HIR or the HR and the B all in a row. So that's probably the same name. And then Zather in the Masoretic lines up very closely with Zathel. And also something to keep in mind, the letters and the sounds R and L are commonly confused by people in languages when they hear it. L and R. Like you hear that common thing that people say about the Japanese, how they have a harder time distinguishing between L and R. So that's a real thing, that it's not just limited to Japanese, where sometimes you hear L when it's actually R, or vice versa. So, but clearly Zather is probably the same name as Zathel, even though it has tha at the end. And then let's see. And Biztha or Biztha and Bazan, the Baz, B-A-Z or B-Z is probably corresponds with the B-Z name. And that Umen Mehuman name probably corresponds with the Ammon name. So so that's how I rearranged it a little bit to line up the names. And then Old Latin version, if you go back to mine, has different names. It has Mehusma, and then randomly it has Akedes, then Nurbana, almost identical to Herbana, but with the N instead of an H. Tarakti seems kind of similar to Baratzi, and then Nabitha, similar to Abigtha and Abitsa. Zathai, similar to Zather or Zathel. And then Thara, similar to Tharis. The only one I can compare to that is Carcass, so it probably lines up with that. And Old Latin, I think they might have had the names in a different place too, if I'm not mistaken. But so I tried to line up the names to correspond. So we have about 15 minutes left here. So let me see. Let me see what we want to say here for chapter 1. Chapter 11, you see the Masoretic has the people and the princes. The Septuagint in Old Latin switches the order, the princes and the nations. And the second line, the alpha text shortens it significantly. So the alpha text must not be authentic in that instance. Earlier in verse 11, it says in the Masoretic, the queen before the king, whereas the Septuagint in the Old Latin says before him to enthrone her. So the Masoretic is interpreting the word as a noun, whereas the similar word, the same basic word, is being interpreted as a verb in these other two versions. Because the word for king can also mean rule or to make ruler. So if you look at verse 12, it says in the Masoretic and the Alpha, the Queen Vashti refused the commandment of the king. But the Septuagint in the Old Latin, the Septuagint says refused him. The Old Latin just says refused. So if you take the Septuagint refused him, it doesn't make sense for someone to take him and change it to say the commandment of the king. If they were going to take him, they would replace it with the king. So the full phrase, the command of the king, seems to be authentic because it doesn't make sense for the command of the king to be replaced with him. So you can see the logic there. Let's see here. Never mind. But the alpha text repeats the information. The king, hearing that Vashti refused his commandment. All the other versions do not have that repetition, so the alpha text is probably wrong in that instance. Okay. We got some more names. The Masoretic is the only one that preserves the names in a good way at all. So it's Karshena, Shetar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsena, and Memucan. The Septuagint says Sharkesha, so it changes the order of the C and the SH. And in the SH at the end, it's changed from an N. And then you have Shethar versus Sharsath, so switching the R and the TH. And then it only has 3 names. The other names are missing. The other name being Maliser, again, R being confused with L. In the Old Latin, randomly says Mordecai, and then it has Sharathaeus, Pabatalius. Of course, the eus is endings of Greek that were preserved in the Latin. Okay, Malisath and Muke. That corresponds with Memucan. But clearly, the other versions did not know how to properly render the names. They did not do a good job at all. So 100% of the time in the Book of Esther, the Septuagint and butchers the names. It's just really bad. So when it comes to names, don't trust the Septuagint. That's what we can see by this evidence, including the fact that it says Artaxerxes instead of Xerxes, Xerxes being the correct name. And many times the translations of names get it bad because the copyists didn't have a context for those names. So over time, the copyists will start making mistakes because they don't know. Like, so let me give you an example. Let's say I told you, okay, guys, I want you to copy a Chinese document. You're gonna copy a bunch of names, and every next person's gonna make a copy of that, and the next person's gonna make a copy of that. The next person's gonna make a copy of that. Well, eventually, people who don't know Chinese very well, they're gonna butcher their names because they don't know. Whoops, I just misspelled that name with a similar letter. Whoops, my bad. And then the next person that copies, they won't be able to correct the difference because they won't realize. So now, after a few copies, you have a completely wrong name. So that is something that has happened in some books of the Old Testament with names. The scribes make a bad mistake in the beginning, and then a later scribe doesn't realize it's a mistake, and they copy it. And a later scribe then makes their own mistake, and then another scribe is copying their mistake. So the names get changed in that kind of way. But the Old Latin says Mordecai. That seems to be a change by the scribe because they said, well, Mordecai is one of the people, so let's include him in this. Why isn't he being included? So that seems to be why Mordecai is there. Now, if you take a look, verse 14, the alpha text is completely the first half. It doesn't mention the names at all. Alpha text does not mention the names. It also does not have any of verse 15. So as we said before, the alpha text is shorter. Also for verse 15, the Masoretic says the commandment of Xerxes the king by the hand of the chamberlains. Now that phrase "by the hand of" is consistently shortened in Greek versions of other books of the Old Testament as well. So "by the hand of" is correct because that's a Hebraism. But the Xerxes reading is probably not correct because that's a clarification that you don't need. The commandment of the king. It's sufficient to say the king. You don't need to say Xerxes the king. So it was probably the case that the Masoretic scribe added the name Xerxes because the other two versions don't have that name. Verse 16, you have the name Memucan. The Septuagint says Muka, so that's close. The alpha text says Buka, so the B and the M are similar. And the reason for that, so listen to this. In the book of Genesis, the name Nimrod, the guy's name Nimrod, right? In the Septuagint, his name is Nebrod. So Nimrod versus Nebrod. Nebrod versus Nimrod. So how is the M versus the B? Well, picture for a second here the name Nimrod. Now, you know how we say the word dumb, D-U-M-B, dumb, dumb, m. When you say the last letter M, the letter M has a sound that the scientists refer to as a labial sound. Labial refers to the lips because you use the lips to pronounce it. So you're using the lips to pronounce m. That same formation occurs when you say the letters P and B. P and B. You're using your mouth. So they call it labial letters or labial sounds. So because of this they're all the same characterization of sound. They can easily be confused by later people. So you got dumb, dumber, someone's dumber, dumb. So you also have Nimrod. So if you say it fast, Nimrod, it sounds like a B. Nimrod. That over time they pronounced it so fast they thought that it was a B instead of an M. So they rendered it as a B, Nibrod. And so that mistake happens in other instances. In many times throughout my studies of language, I've seen B be confused with an M or a P. So we have muka being confused into buka. And of course, then Old Latin's like Muka. I think that's Mordecai. I don't get where the Old Latin coming from. I think the Old Latin just was confused, and they're like, well, Mordecai is familiar to us, so we'll change it to Mordecai. Okay, 1 second. So unfortunately, we're getting close to the end tonight because we had to end early. I'm gonna see if there's anything else in chapter 1 we'll say. Verse 18, you have in the Septuagint, the third line, of the princes, that has the brackets, the squiggly brackets. In the Masoretic text, it's in the next line. Have heard unto all the princes of the king. So that tells us that it's possible that the Hebrew text had it in a different order. On the other hand, the Septuagint probably was just translating loosely or freely. Free translation occurs sometimes by the scribes. So most likely there wasn't a different Hebrew text. It was just being translated more freely. But there are times where and the word or the letter and is added into the text to change how the sentence is to be divided. So sometimes the single presence of and can change the order of the translation. So if you remove and, it becomes more ambiguous, and then you can put that phrase in the one sentence or in the next sentence, depending where you put the period. So that sometimes that's the explanation for the differences between the Septuagint and Masoretic. You're simply putting a sentence ending in one, before one word or before the other word, and then it changes which word is being assigned to which verb or which clause when you interpret where the sentence ends. So sometimes that explains the differences between the two versions. Verse 18, it says, in the Old Latin, it has a bunch more, in insulting them, or what would prevent the scandal against the king from being repeated also amongst those who are outside of the kingdom. So that's kind of a unique addition right there. Okay. Verse 19, at the very end, it says Washti in the Masoretic and Alpha, but in the Septuagint it just says the queen. But in the Old Latin it says Washti the queen. So it seems like the Old Latin took the two versions and combined them together. And you have a Masoretic says Xerxes the king. Old Latin says Artaxerxes the king. Alpha says the king, and Septuagint says him. So that makes it more complicated of which reading is the correct reading. I would say the correct reading is probably him or the king, and not Xerxes the king or Artaxerxes the king. All right, so it's 9 o'clock here. We said we end it. Chris, did you want to wrap it up? Is there anything? I don't think there was any comments. It doesn't look like there's any really comments or questions. Wait, I can't hear you.
Okay. Last call. If you have a question, just drop it in the live chat. In the meantime, you can find Onieh's contact information and his other content, his YouTube channel and his Facebook group in the description. So, for those of you who are interested in looking up more on Onieh's content, you have it there in the description box. So, tomorrow, Onieh, just to confirm, tomorrow you want to pick up part 3. We'll just do one more part 3 tomorrow. Is that what you're
Do,
thinking about?
do you? Let's see. So you're going to continue through your series, right?
Yeah.
Um, I just wonder if maybe it might be better to like if I was to do it on the Friday or the Saturday. But if not, if you want me to do it tomorrow, I can do it tomorrow. What do you think is best?
Um,
Because maybe it's better to do it
Saturday.
tomorrow, but
It's
Saturday.
yeah. I think Saturday would. Yeah, if you want to do it again on Saturday, pick it up. The last part. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's good. So that it'll just be a week delay in terms of chronologically, but that's okay because you already went through Esther, and so, but I'll go through more. Sorry, I didn't get to go through more of it. I only got through 3 of the chapters, but so
Very very intricate. It's like it's almost like you're writing a dictionary.
yeah, there's a whole science to it if you wouldn't believe. So,
Yeah, I can imagine. It's just a lot of work for sure. So
but
yeah, so
the important thing is what my work is doing is it's giving you guys the information. I'm going to make my conclusions, but you guys have a luxury to disagree with any of my conclusions, and you see all the different versions and what they say, so you can decide. Oh, I actually like that reading. I think it's more accurate. So that's what it's
very
for.
yeah, it's very interesting, very useful for sure. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much again, Onieh. Appreciate your work. It's just an amazing work there. Like I said, it's I can just imagine between you and your friend there, it's like writing a dictionary. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a lot of work I can see. It's a lot of information, a lot of stuff to go through, and it's amazing. You know, a lot of people need to know this stuff. I believe. I mean, the differences between the different manuscripts and that. I think it's very
Well,
important.
well, especially because people base entire doctrines on a single letter or a single word difference.
Yeah,
So,
exactly, exactly. Okay, so no questions today. So yeah, I'm going to wrap it up, and Lord willing, we'll pick it up again on Saturday. In the meantime, tomorrow, Monday, I will do my regular thing with going through the scriptures in, like I said, a roughly chronological order, and uh, and so yeah, thank you again, Onieh. It's just been a blessing as usual, and just so much information, so much to digest here.
yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and I look forward to Saturday when we can I think we should be able to finish the rest of it. If we see it's taking a long time on Saturday, and I could just uh, speed up the process, and just read like the main sections, and so we'll finish it. We'll wrap it up Saturday.
Okay. Tammy says, thank you, Onieh. This was very informative. I'm doing a huge study on the authenticity of scripture from back to front. Wow. Yeah, it's amazing. And this is a good part of it. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't know this stuff, and a lot of people, hey, I didn't, when I first, really started getting involved in this kind of thing and studying the Bible, I didn't know any of this stuff. Okay. So, Yes, for those of you who are new here, I do this every day, uh, by the grace of God, every single day, 6 days a week at 7 p.m. Eastern. That's from Sunday to Friday, and every Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Um, we do a Shabbat thing, and like I said, Lord willing, Onieh will be with us again on next Shabbat, or this coming Shabbat. Onieh, do you have any information you want to share with the people, like your contact information, or is what you have
Um,
your
I
Facebook group?
I have a Facebook group as well as my Facebook account. You can find me under the same name, Onieh Safirboal, and my Dead Sea Scrolls Religion YouTube channel is where I post uh, my things. So my version of the Bible, um, I will eventually be presenting it on my YouTube channel as well as in my Facebook group, and I'm sure I will be also announcing it to Christopher Enoch. So in future time, when publications start to be released, I'll have Christopher Enoch share it with you guys, that information. But you can also find it on your own by coming to my my sites or contacting me directly. Um, my email address is onieh777 at gmail.com. So you can send me an email as well if you have any questions. For Book of Esther specifically, since I'll be presenting it for a final time on Saturday, I'll have enough time to finish the remaining two chapters. So then, I can have a complete thing. So if you guys want, I can share the PDF file. Um, but again, this is only part two of the process, so I won't consider it officially done and ready for the public until part three, where it's my actual translation. So, but anyways, that's all to say.
All right. Well, thanks again, Onieh, and thank you all for watching, and thanks for the greetings in the chat. You guys are awesome as always. We'll see you again tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. Eastern, same time, same place. All right. So as always, I pray for each and every one of you that the Lord bless you and keep you, make His face to shine upon you, lift up His countenance upon you, and give you wonderful, wonderful shalom. Amen. Amen.
Have a
See you
wonderful
tomorrow
week,
night.
guys.
Amen.